Good morning, everybody. My name is Christina Wigrin, and I'm with Stilly Valley Health Connections. I want to thank you all for joining us for today's class, which will discuss vaping trends and perspectives. For those of you who are joining us live, please note that this class is set up in a Zoom webinar format. This means that all of our participants are muted and your videos are turned off so that we can record the presentation. However, if you would like to leave any questions or comments, we encourage you to do so by using the chat or the Q&A box, which are both located at the bottom of your screen. And now I will pass it over to Alex Sorotsky with the Washington Poison Center, who will be presenting on today's topic. Thank you, Alex, for being here again, and thank you to those of you who have joined us so far. We hope that you enjoy this class and learn a lot.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christina. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or evening if you're tuning into the recording sometime in the future. Thank you all so much for being here. Like Christina said, my name is Alex Sorotsky. I use he/him pronouns. I am a public health educator with the Washington Poison Center. I work on a really great team. So if anyone is tuning in from the east side of the state, please, and you have questions, you'd like to schedule an additional training, anything like that, I can always put you in contact with my Eastern Washington counterpart, Justin Mauger, as well. Like Christina said, please ask questions throughout. I'll keep an eye out on the chat box and the Q&A box, and we'll do my best to answer things as they come up. If we get pressed for time, depending on how chatty the group is, how energized everyone is on this Friday morning, I may hold off on questions on answering them until the end, but please, please, please ask them as you have them. All right, so just a very basic roadmap of today, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the Washington Poison Center, who we are, what we do, why I'm here talking about vaping. I hope you've all heard of us, but if not, that will change in the next few slides. I'll go through some common basics for all vape devices, or at least most vape devices. Then we'll start honing in on nicotine for a time, and then cannabis for a time, and then we'll go ahead and close out from there. But before we dive into the Washington Poison Center and who we are and what we do, well, I beat my got ahead of myself with the housekeeping bit on encouraging you to ask questions in the chat box and the Q&A box. But for those who are tuning in live, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat box, if you're comfortable doing so. And I'd love to hear what you're hoping to gain from today. If there are specific questions you have up front, if there are specific things you're hoping to learn, that's helpful for me to know, because then if we have time, I can kind of tailor certain things to try to address that. All right, so if you've never heard of the Washington Poison Center before, you may have heard of poison centers in general, poison control. There are so many poison centers across the country, 53 total. We are one of them. Now, we cover the whole state of Washington. Some states have multiple poison centers, and some poison centers cover multiple states. But we're one of the one center to the state centers here. So our mission is just right here: to prevent and reduce harm from poisoning through expertise, collaboration, and education. So really, I bring this up because a lot of the times when folks ask me to speak about vaping or cannabis or opioids or whatever it might be, sometimes there can be a bit of a polarization between more of the prevention field and the harm reduction field. And I like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Poison Center is really for all of this. We love preventing things from going wrong. We love reducing harm whenever possible, and we love being able to provide treatment when something has gone wrong, or treatment advice when something has gone wrong. So the main way we provide that treatment advice is really through our call center. I'll get to that in just a moment, but I always have to, if you've seen me present before, and thank you for the introduction, I see you in the chat box here. So you're probably familiar with this slide. I use it in almost all of my presentations. I have to define what I mean by poison. Now, for a lot of folks, myself included, before working for the Poison Center, when I heard this term poison, I used to think very like murder mystery novel kind of substances. So cyanide and arsenic and ricin, and things like that. Yes, those are all very poisonous. Please don't go playing with arsenic. And for us, a poison's literally anything, any product, any substance that can be harmful if it's used in the wrong way, by the wrong person, or in the wrong amount. That can be household products, plants, cleaners, bites and stings from animals and insects, as well as medications, in addition to illicit substances. I know some folks who are a little more like technically oriented or really set on specific definitions may be like, well, a snake bite, that's going to be venom, not a poison. We take calls for snake bites too. So if you just know that we have this very broad umbrella approach to this term poison. Now you can call the poison center in any potential poison emergency or to ask a question. It does not have to be an emergency to call us. So if you take a medication and you want to make sure you're curious about a supplement, you want to make sure they're safe to take together, give us a call. We're happy to walk you through that before something goes wrong and help prevent that if we can. Um, we encourage folks to call us in a potential poison emergency before 911. In most cases, because we're most of the time actually able to keep you at home. The big exceptions there on if something seems immediately life-threatening. So if the person you're calling for is not breathing, they're not conscious, they're not responding to you, they're having a seizure, anything like that, do not call us and call 911. But short of that, if the person is responsive, they are breathing, they're conscious, they're not having a seizure, we recommend you call us first because again, where there's a very good chance we can keep you at home. I think last year for 2024, we kept 93% of folks at home who called us first. We are a free service. We're never gonna charge you anything like that. Oh, and you can call about yourself or someone else. A lot of the times when I'm tabling at an event, someone will be like, "Oh, I know you guys, I love you guys, but my kids have moved out. I'm good." And I'll remind that we do take calls for adults as well. All right, so I've been teasing the poison helpline, but haven't actually said that phone number yet. So 800-222-1222. This is that national number. It's going to route you to your local poison center, depending on where you're calling from. I know some folks who are like right on the border with Oregon, maybe in like the Vancouver area. On occasion, those calls make it the Oregon Poison Center. Some Oregon residents get the Washington Poison Center. It's typically not a problem. Um, you're going to get the same kind of treatment advice regardless of the poison center you get a hold of. The only time we're going to transfer you, or some of the only times we would really transfer you to your true regional poison center, is if there's concern and consideration about referring you to a hospital because those centers know their region's hospitals. But we are always open. You can call literally right now. You can call at 4 in the morning. Someone's going to answer that phone. We're a free service. We're confidential, so we're not sharing information. We will do some care coordination with hospitals or paramedics if someone's arriving on scene and they call us, and that kind of thing. But we're not sharing your info out. We also have interpretation services, so if you know anyone who prefers a language other than English, please, please, please encourage them to contact us in a potential poison situation. We can pull that interpreter into any conversation. Also, a free service. Okay, so let's dive into some vaping definitions. So I like starting with basics. So this is probably review for some of you who've attended versions of this before. But this is a big broad category of really any battery operated device that heats up some substance. We typically see nicotine or THC, but it is technically possible to vape other substances. They often will have flavoring and additional chemicals, and they create an aerosol that users inhale. Now, we're pretty intentional about trying to use the term aerosol instead of vapor with these products because vapor typically implies water vapor or steam. In what's being released from these devices that someone inhales is oil particles. So not water based as much as oil based, and that's a very 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 different than steam. So, like I said, most of the time with these devices, folks are vaping nicotine products. On occasion, folks may be vaping just like a flavored solution without nicotine. That's not super common, but it does happen. Um, and we do get a lot of cases of folks who are vaping cannabis, and we'll dig into the different formulations of this in that section. Pardon me, folks. And again, it is possible to vape other substances. We don't come across it very often, though. Anecdotally, I don't know if this is the case in Washington, but chatting with poison center educators from across the country, I've seen advertisements for like melatonin vape products and things along those lines. So vaping is not just limited to these substances, but this is what we happen to see most. This is what we have the most data on. Oops. R. There. All right. One common theme across all vaping products is that they have an abundance of what we call ultrafine particles, or they release an abundance of these ultrafine particles. When we're comparing a vaping device with a combustible cigarette, so classic cigarette, we tend to see a lot more of these ultrafine particles in the vape aerosol compared to the cigarette smoke. That is not to say vaping is more dangerous than smoking. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but it is a unique consideration with vape devices. Now, ultrafine particles, they're yeah, just as the name sounds, they're very, very small particles. The smaller the particle, the deeper it can get into your lungs. So there is just some general concern for how deeply substances through this vape device can get into your body compared to smoke particles. So just keep that in mind. And that applies to, that's not unique to vaping. We can see a lot of ultrafine particles, for example, around plane exhaust, like airplane exhaust, jet exhaust. So there can be some unique like in respiratory considerations for folks like working in airports or living near airports. Okay, so nicotine, again, starting with basic definition. So nicotine, it's a natural chemical found in the tobacco plant first and foremost. There are synthetic versions of it. We see nicotine in tons and tons of different products. We see it in pesticides because it is a natural pesticide. It's the tobacco plant's main defense mechanism against bugs and insects. We of course have seen it in centuries of smoking products, cigarettes, cigars, pipes, etc. Um, we also have seen it in smokeless tobacco products, chew, snus, dry snuff, in various types thereof. There have been more and more reports of nicotine pouches being more of a thing. And then vaping products, of course, in the last goodness, it's heading toward 2 decades almost since nicotine vape products have been in the United States market. So folks may have heard this term vape juice or e-juice. This is just generally referring to the solution typically containing nicotine that is in a lot of these products. We often see propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin in the vape juice. That kind of helps aerosolize the nicotine and keep it suspended somewhat evenly or distributed evenly throughout that solution. And then we often still see flavoring. And of course, there's a big range of concentrations. This has the rules around concentration limits have tightened up in the years they've been in the United States, but there's still pretty big range there. So, working at the Poison Center, I often frame things around acute concern. Acute means short term, in the moment. What can happen if I'm using in this moment? Not talking about chronic use or ongoing use so much for this slide. So typically when someone calls the Poison Center, it's because something has gone wrong in that moment, or they have a question about a singular event. So nicotine can get into the body through three main ways, three main routes. Inhalation, that's breathing it in. Ingestion, that's eating or drinking it. Or absorption, sometimes it can pass through surfaces on the body. Specifically in the mouth, so the cheeks, under the gums, under the tongue, those surfaces, certain substances can pass through pretty easily, nicotine being one of them. Now, nicotine in low doses tends to act like a stimulant, so it kind of speeds things up in the body. We can see corresponding symptoms with that. We can see upset stomach, dizziness, headache, tremor, elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, pale or clammy skin. And I don't have it written here, but it is absolutely worth mentioning. For a lot of folks, nicotine releases dopamine. It releases that euphoric, pleasurable sensation as well, especially in those low doses. It's a big part of why it is so strongly tied to tolerance and dependence and addiction. Now, in large doses, nicotine kind of flips. It starts acting more like a depressant. Now, big exception here is seizures and high doses. Some folks may actually seize, not a depressant symptom there typically. But if someone has a large amount of nicotine, and they're starting to get confused. If they have a lowering of their heart rate or blood pressure, if they seem really lethargic, really weak, they may actually start having trouble breathing after that. So if there is any suspicion that anyone of any age has had just a very high dose of nicotine in a given occasion for a given exposure, that's a time to call us. But if they start having trouble breathing, call 911. There is a chance, it's not common, but it is possible to overdose, to have a lethal overdose of nicotine. And it disrupts our breathing pathways, somewhat similar to how an opioid might in a overdose situation. Now, I'm going to share a little bit of poison center data. Always got to give some caveats and considerations for poison center data. There is no real requirement for folks to call us. So what I'm sharing with you is going to be an underrepresentation of the number of exposures, the number of cases of someone ingesting or inhaling nicotine in the state. So changes in our data can happen for a lot of reasons. It could be, folks know to call us more. It could be that we have a change in access to a substance. It could be large scale reactions to stresses, to traumas. COVID-19 was a really big one. We had shifts in a lot of our substance exposures. We had shifts in a lot of, we had a big increase in folks calling about cleaning product exposures, things like that. And like I said earlier, most of the time folks are calling us in an acute exposure situation, not a chronic, kind of more ongoing situation. So this is 2024 data, and it is actually quite similar to the past few years of data. I've worked for the Poison Center since 2019. And the numbers may shift slightly, but the general trend has remained about the same since I've been here, that most of our nicotine related calls are for little kids. And what this tells me and folks at the Poison Center is that this is generally from a lack of safe storage. So this means that in households where nicotine is present, adults are not storing it as safely as they could be. Anytime it's a 3-year-old getting into something, the 3-year-old's not like, I'm gonna light up and get a nicotine buzz. Three-year-olds like, what is that? It might be candy. I'm going to eat it. Because that's how they explore the world. Now, of course, we do get calls for other age groups as well, but very rarely, or relatively rarely, compared to those younger child exposures. And for reference, we had 493 total cases involving nicotine in 2024. Now, when we start looking at reason, this will be a little more nuanced when we look at the cannabis data later on. But for nicotine, almost any time it's a child under the age of 6, we're going to report it as what we call unintentional general. That just means it was an accident. This individual was not cognitively able to make a decision one way or the other. They weren't trying to get high. They weren't trying to ingest for some sensation or other reason. It was just curiosity and impulse. This other category, though, intentional abuse, for poison centers, I want to acknowledge abuse is a rather tricky term because it can be rather stigmatizing in the context of substances and substance use. I list it directly here because it's still tied to how poison centers code. their data. And so when we have an intentional abuse case, that means that that person was trying to get intoxicated. They were trying to reach some psychoactive state. We also have this category of misuse, and that's generally like using something incorrectly. This doesn't happen too often, but that could mean that someone saw the vape juice and thought they were supposed to drink it rather than vape it. Things like that. Now, this is not every single reason someone calls the poison center involving nicotine, but these are the most common, which tells you how rare these other reasons are. So when we look at nicotine cases by type, we can get a lot more nuance than this, but I think it can be helpful to kind of compare broad vaping products to broad tobacco products. Um, Now, tobacco products in this case is going to include cigarettes, cigars, pipe tobacco, that kind of thing. Vaping products are going to include whether it's the solution itself, that e-juice itself, whether someone grabbed a hold of the actual vape device and got some of that liquid in that way. That's going to include all of those. Now, this has actually changed since I've been with the Poison Center over the past 6 years. We used to have far more cases of tobacco product exposures for little kids, pretty significantly, actually. We had quite a few more of those tobacco product exposure. So a common example would be a child put a cigarette butt in their mouth, something like that. This has changed though over time. We're starting to see a lot more vaping product exposures. Now, when it comes to ingestion of these vaping products, they can be a pretty big concern because the concentration of nicotine can be much, much, much higher in the liquid than it is in something like a cigarette. It's also relatively easy if you see a child pop a cigarette butt in their mouth to kind of sweep that cigarette butt out. They're less likely to absorb very much if they don't swallow it. With the vaping products, if they get that liquid nicotine in their mouth, even if they don't swallow it, even if they spit it out, there's a good chance quite a bit of it absorbs through the cheeks, under the gum, or under the tongue by the gums. So if that ever happens, even if the child spits it out, please give us a call. Because it may be a time where we recommend you get them into a healthcare facility for observation. Still call us if a child puts a cigarette butt in their mouth. We'll still walk you through kind of what symptoms to look out for. But do keep in mind there is that extra concern for those vaping product ingestions. All right, now I'm advancing to the next slide. Sorry, I kept jumping ahead of myself there. I'm not going to linger on this too much, but I do want to set up a discussion on these two main types of nicotine we see with vaping products. The two broad categories are free-base nicotine and salt-based nicotine. What you're seeing here on the screen is a pH scale. This is about the extent of my chemistry knowledge. But basically, the human body really likes a pH of 7. That's where our human bodies tend to exist, is a pH of 7. Now, the further away from 7 you go in either direction, either closer to 0 or closer to 14, the harsher that substance is for the body, the more destructive it can be for the body. Free-base nicotine generally has a pH anywhere from 8 to 8.5. Free-base nicotine is the type of nicotine we generally see in cigarettes and cigars and in those combustible tobacco products. It's also the same kind of nicotine we saw in early vapes, some of the earlier vapes on the market. There are still vapes on the market that use free-base nicotine. But the good folks at Juul, I'm sure folks are at least somewhat aware of Juul. They were the first company to figure out what we now call salt-based nicotine, where they added salt-based acids into the liquid nicotine solution, and they brought the pH level closer to that of the human body. So the sensation of inhaling it is reportedly less harsh. It doesn't mean salt-based nicotine is better for you, less bad for you, but it does mean that it's easier to have higher concentrations. Higher concentrations means you need less overall liquid, which means you need a smaller, you don't need as large of a chamber, you don't need as large of a battery to heat up that liquid, you don't need as large of a heating element that the battery charges. All of this to say, you get a smaller device. So salt-based nicotine was really what allowed Juul and now other products to go from, much larger devices to much smaller, more discrete devices. So this is not a comprehensive list of every single vape that is out on the market now, or that has ever been out on the market. But these are some of the broad categories we have seen over the years. Now, everything to the left of that center dotted line uses free-base nicotine. Everything to the right uses salt-based nicotine. The very first ones we saw on the market, they're still around today, but less common, were the true e-cigarettes. You'll notice, or you might notice, I've generally avoided using the term e-cigarette up to this point because e-cigarettes, like most folks, especially most folks who do vape or use vape devices, think of these early products when they hear the term e-cigarettes. They, were intended to be used until they ran out of juice or ran out of battery and thrown away and then replaced. They were made to emulate the act of smoking. We also see these mid-sized vape pens, e-hookah, sometimes folks called them. Their big selling point was they were refillable and rechargeable. And of course, we have these box mods. Now, these images aren't to scale, but box mods, some of them can be small, some of them can be really rather large. But all of them are generally much more powerful than the pens and the e-cigarettes. So if you're ever out in the world, you're walking, you're driving, you see someone walk by and they release this rather large plume, whether just while walking or maybe in their car, providing their car is like not on fire or anything. That large plume likely indicates that they're using a box mod because they're much more powerful. They can release just quite a bit of that aerosol all at once. Then I had mentioned Juul earlier. They were the first to figure out salt-based nicotine, but certainly not the last. We have a lot of refillable, rechargeable pod vapes. And then one of the bigger types of vapes that are concerning now and have been for a number of years are these disposable salt-based vapes. Now, a lot of these vape devices you see on the screen here are not in the FDA approved list of vapes, but are often sold anyway. That's kind of a much larger discussion, but it is worth noting that even though there is regulation around these disposable flavored products that you see in the end here, those disposable salt-based, they're still relatively accessible for adults and teens in the US. Now, just a little bit on nicotine. I want to pay attention to time and not hold anyone past the hour here. But a little bit on nicotine in the brain. Now, we know this from years and years and years of combustible tobacco research. Now, nicotine reaches the brain very, very, very quickly. Inhalation is a very rapid delivery system of any substance. So whether it is a smoking product or a vaping product, inhaling nicotine hits that brain very quickly. It interacts with that reward system I mentioned earlier that releases dopamine. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the chemical or neurotransmitter dopamine, it's our brain's feel-good button. So when we're really hungry and we finally are able to sit down and have a really good meal, that feeling of joy and pleasure and contentment you have once your belly is full, there's a good chance your body's releasing a lot of dopamine because you were hungry, you ate, and it's giving you a gold star for good behavior. It's trying to reinforce what it deems necessary for survival. So nicotine and other substances as well can tap in to that same system. So, we'll talk about addiction and like use disorder in the next slide here. But it's worth, in my opinion, I think it's important to acknowledge there are many reasons why someone might seek out nicotine. And this is outside of, or in addition to like youth and peer pressure and wanting to look cool and all of that. A lot of folks use nicotine because of that dopamine, because it feels good. A lot of folks may use it for short-term decreases in stress and anxiety. We can see increased mood control. again, in the short term. We can also see improved concentration. Again, it is a stimulant in lower doses. You'll see me having sips of my coffee this morning, another stimulant that helps focus and improve concentration. A lot of folks also report that nicotine helps suppress their appetite. So if they're wanting to decrease their appetite for whatever reason, that might be one route they go about it. Now, our bodies break down nicotine rather quickly. Um, that leads our brains to crave more that much faster. Then the more nicotine we use, the more receptors our brains actually generate, actually creates that react to nicotine. So basically, this means the more we have, the more our brain is ready to take, the more our brain is expecting that intake of that substance, and at times demanding that intake of substance. So the more we use, and this is true of so many substances, but for nicotine, the more we use, the more we see alterations to how we learn, how we manage our stress, and our own self-control, our impulse control. It is also worth acknowledging nicotine is one of the most difficult substances to walk away from because of how strongly it forms dependence and tolerance. When folks do quit or reduce their use, they can go through some really profound withdrawal symptoms. They may experience incredible difficulty concentrating. Again, you're very used to this stimulant that's helping you focus. You take that away, that's a heck of an adjustment period. There may be a lot of irritability. Folks may go through some depression. You know, you're used to having this release of dopamine, the somewhat constant release of dopamine that you stop. So your brain has to readjust and find its homeostasis again. Folks may go through restlessness, through anxiety, even insomnia. Some really, really, really tough symptoms. So I am not an expert in treating a tobacco use disorder, but I do want to acknowledge there is very good success rates with combining nicotine replacement therapy. So that's nicotine gum, the lozenge, the patch, things along those lines. Combining that nicotine replacement therapy with tobacco cessation counselors, with that additional support, with that guidance, can be incredibly effective. And a lot of where folks can run into barriers is if they use those nicotine replacement therapy options but don't know all the ins and outs of them. So again, not an expert in that, but I do want to put that on folks' radars, that there are quite a few treatment options for nicotine addiction. Now, it's worth acknowledging all of those issues I listed of things that can go awry with nicotine addiction is doubly true for using nicotine in adolescence. Using any substance early on, but especially nicotine, can have much more long-lasting effects on all of those issues I mentioned. So attention, learning, mood, impulse control, how we deal with stress, how we regulate ourselves. Because our brain is going through this period of development, it latches on to external substances far more rapidly than adult brains, than fully developed brains. Now, there are some additional considerations to keep in mind with a lot of these products outside of nicotine. It is true that in general, vaping devices, the liquid nicotine, the e-juice has fewer total carcinogens than combustible cigarettes, but that does not mean there are no carcinogens. So we can see some release of heavy metals. This is a cross section of an old, like kind of corroded jewel pod, or jewel cartridge, excuse me. So folks are not putting lead and tin and nickel, manganese, all these heavy metals. They aren't intentionally putting that in the liquid nicotine, but those metals can be used in the construction of the devices themselves. And when they heat up and cool off rapidly, they can release some of those heavy metals, and that can latch on to the aerosol as someone's inhaling it. You can also see flavoring. Now, flavoring regulation is really tightened up compared to where it used to be. And like I said, with those disposable salt-based vaping devices, there are still quite a few vape products with flavor that slip through the cracks. So flavoring, a lot of flavoring is FDA approved for ingestion, but not inhalation. And when inhaled, it can lead to quite a few concerns. Diacetyl is a pretty infamous one, linked to something called popcorn lung, so we can see lesions develop in the airway from inhaling something like diacetyl. Propylene glycol, that's one of those suspension agents I mentioned earlier. Another case of it's approved for ingestion in certain quantities, but not inhalation. And once it's heated up to a certain point, it can actually start to release formaldehyde. Our bodies don't need formaldehyde. Silicon and free radicals and pesticides, as well as something called nitrosamines. This is a really large category of carcinogens. We actually see a lot of these in combustible cigarettes, and we do see some of them in vape devices as well. Okay, I'm gonna have a sip of water and a sip of coffee and transition to cannabis for our last now 24 minutes here. Please hit me with any nicotine specific questions if you have them. All right. Well, I'm not seeing the chat box explode, but definitely feel free to hit me with nicotine questions during the cannabis portion. I don't mind hopping back. We can keep things a little non-linear sometimes. Now, I'm not going to linger on this too much. There are 1,001 names for cannabis. If anyone is kind of interested in looking further, just Google like terms for cannabis. You'll likely come across a DEA document that it's like a multi-hundred page document just filled with different slang terms. Fascinating read. But folks may also recognize the term marijuana, pot, weed, kush, ganja, so many different terms for this. I'm predominantly going to use this term cannabis and kind of hone in on some of the specific components I want to draw attention to. Um, Feel free to ask questions on terminology, but I want to keep us moving. So, cannabis sativa, this is one of the scientific names for this plant, this type of plant. This plant has so much variety. Some versions of it are used, of course, for drugs, for substances that whether it's more with the intention being more therapeutic or medicinal, or the intention being to get high, to reach that intoxication. We see a lot of drug products come from this plant. We also see a ton of non-drug products. So hemp. Oh, you know what? I'm realizing I overshot my first definition here. Let me take a step back. Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That's THC. It's worth mentioning because this is the main intoxicating component or cannabinoid, as well as the main regulated component in the cannabis plant. So generally, the way our regulation works on a federal level, anything with more than 0.3% THC is considered a Schedule 1 substance and is federally illegal. We're getting a lot of that state-based legalization anyway. A lot of that is built around medical cannabis. A lot of it is built around retail cannabis. Feel free to ask questions on the distinctions between those. It really varies state by state. But hemp is a version of this plant that has less than 0.3% THC. It used to be Schedule 1, now it's not scheduled at all. And it's kind of tricky because hemp can be used to make a lot of non-drug products, rope, and soap, and all these different fabrics and textiles and foods, and like hemp protein powders, a big thing. And so, there are a lot of applications for this plant outside of drugs, but there are also quite a few drug products. Hemp can all, just worth mentioning, hemp can also be used to extract other non-THC cannabinoids that are themselves still intoxicating. Okay, so again, working at a poison center, our focus is often on what goes wrong in the short term if you have too much. So THC gets into the body very similarly to nicotine. But it's kind of all over the place with the symptoms. We get reports of folks being really sleepy, really lethargic. There can be a lot of Of course, mood change. A lot of folks are going to feel that euphoria. Again, it releases dopamine similar to nicotine. They may be relaxed. They may actually be anxious. It can go kind of all over the place, very much depending on the dose, what other cannabinoids might be at play, as well as the individual. Every human's endocannabinoid system, that's the system that THC acts upon, is different. And, everyone has a different reaction or tolerance to a lot of these products. We can definitely see impaired attention. We can see impaired memory formation. We can see impaired time estimation if someone's intoxicated from cannabis. Some folks are going to have more extreme mood change reactions. So some folks may have panic attacks. Some folks may be really, really on edge and paranoid. And some folks with really high doses may actually hallucinate. They may experience acute psychosis symptoms. We of course see decreased motor coordination, so it's still not a good idea to drive after use. We can see shifts in our heart rate. We can see issues with the stomach and the GI tract. We can see dilated pupils, all sorts of things like that. Now, when it comes to vaping, there are two main forms of cannabis folks can use for vape products. The first is dry flower or dry bud. In Washington, from when I last looked at this, the average concentration of legally sold cannabis in Washington, legally sold flower, excuse me, in Washington is about 20% THC, but it can go down to five, even closer to 0% THC if they're focusing on other cannabinoids, and up to about 30% THC. That seems to be kind of the limit of concentration for the plant itself. But there is a market for folks wanting higher concentrations, and that's where concentrates come in. Bunch of varieties here, so there's a lot of there are liquid versions, there are solid versions, and different vaping devices can use these different versions. But they can get up to sometimes beyond 90% THC. Oh, I'm seeing some formatting issues here, so sorry about that with some of the logo being cut off here. But we see a somewhat similar evolution of THC vapes as we do for nicotine vapes, with a big exception of of that first category, tabletop vapes. They were actually around well before portable vapes were a thing. And that one in particular, I think that's the volcano. If anyone wants to see some entertaining YouTube videos, just Google old volcano commercials, and there's some rather interesting kind of infomercial style advertisements for them. We see, a lot of these handheld portable vapes for cannabis as well. So some are designed solely for the dry flower. It's still releasing those oil particles, but it's releasing them from the leaves. And the idea with that is to heat it up before it just to the point before it combusts, but not where it actually bursts into flame. We of course see sometimes the disposable e-joints. You use them until they run out, throw them away. We can see they're sometimes called dab pens, but we can see pens that are designed with those solid concentrate products in mind. Some products are designed with the liquid concentrates in mind, and then some come with all these different attachments, and you can kind of swap them out depending on the product someone's going for. It's worth noting, for folks may have heard of dabbing. Dabbing is kind of like the cousin to vaping. It is a little distinct. If folks want to get a little technical about it, vaping generally uses what we call convective heat. So a vape device heats up the air heats up the product. It's a less efficient heat transfer. We see it used for both nicotine and cannabis products. It theoretically doesn't release as many carcinogens as dabbing does. So dabbing uses what we call conductive heat. That is a direct form of heat. So you heat up a surface, you put the product on that surface, and it superheats it very quickly. Heats it up very fast and far more thoroughly, but in doing so, it can release a lot of other chemicals. We generally see it only for cannabis products. I've anecdotally heard of folks using dab devices for nicotine, but I don't have data to support that. That was just folks sharing. I have a friend who, that kind of thing. With dabbing, though, we're generally seeing high heat. there is a really good, a really strong potential for very high THC concentrations because you're using a concentrated product and then you're superheating it and releasing kind of everything all at once. It's going to be a very rapid onset of effects. There is a concern for burns. A lot of the times, the way folks are superheating what they call a dab rig is by using something like a blowtorch to get it very, very, very hot there. So, of course, there's the potential for burns, and there's the potential for just a much higher dose than someone is anticipating or intending. Now, looking at Washington Poison Center data, this is 2024 data, breaking down the types of cannabis products we got calls for. About half of our calls are for edibles. And that part of that I think is a bit of a sampling bias because our in Washington, the poison helpline is legally required to be on all cannabis edibles and cannabis beverages. Folks may recognize, I forgot to put the logo in this slide, apologies, but it has a big red hand that says not for kids underneath it. So that puts it on folks' radar. Hey, you need to store this safely, and if something goes wrong, call the poison center. That number is not required to be on flour and concentrates and those other products. So I think that's part of why we get fewer calls with those. But about 23% of our calls involved that dry flour, and about 14% involved the concentrate. So we don't all. It's a little complex to do a data pull to hone in what were vaping specific calls, but our vaping calls would most likely, as well as dabbing calls, be within the concentrates category and some within the dry flower category. All right, getting low on time, so I'm going to start zipping through this a little faster. The data looks a little different when we're looking at age groups of folks who called us. And we, of course, have a lot of little kids just getting into products that aren't stored safely. Um, but we have plenty of older kids, teens, and then adults of every age category getting into cannabis. Um, we see different reasons or more robust reasons, more nuance with our reasons than just unintentional just accidents. Again, there's that intentional abuse category. Makes sense that it's quite a bit higher for cannabis. A lot of folks are seeking it out for that intoxication, those psychoactive effects there. We have a lot of misuse calls, and again, that's just using the product incorrectly. We actually track some therapeutic error calls as well. Therapeutic error means like a medication error. Cannabis is tricky because there is evidence to show for certain ailments, for certain folks, cannabis may have a therapeutic effect. But any medication or potential medication can cause harm if used wrong. And so with cannabis, Washington being a medical cannabis state, we do have coding for therapeutic error. We tend to see that more with adults and older adults. Very little bit on cannabis in the brain. I talked a bit about this earlier, but the endocannabinoid system, that's the system in every human that cannabis acts upon. It does a lot. It interfaces with a lot of other systems in the brain and body. So it has a pretty big effect on our behaviors surrounding stress and anxiety, how we learn, how we form and store memories, our sense of reward, again, with dopamine, as well as others. And it's worth noting, we do see some of these potential positive or therapeutic effects with THC. Also, please don't take this list and say, wow, Alex told me this will help with inflammation. I'm just going to take THC now. Definitely talk to your doctor before administering any product with a therapeutic intent. There are reports of it helping with inflammation. It may be helpful for short-term sleep disturbance for some folks. Emphasis on short-term. We do have actually quite a bit of data that shows it can be helpful at reducing nausea. For especially for folks who are going through something intense like chemotherapy. We see some potential for application with chronic pain management. And there is data. There's actually a FDA-approved product for this that to help reduce seizures, epileptic seizures. That specific product is called Epidiolex, and it's been out on the market for a few years now. Now, adolescents one of its hallmarks is brain development, this massive brain restructuring. The endocannabinoid system is very, very, very active during adolescence, which makes sense. It's helping regulate other body systems, telling systems, "Hey, man, take a breath, chill out, it's okay," or "Hey, we got to up production of A, B, and C here." So the concern with use of any substance during adolescence, but cannabis in this case, means that there's a much greater risk of forming dependence to that substance. Now, when I was an undergrad, quite a few years ago now, I distinctly remember taking a class um, on it was a biology class that focused on pharmaceuticals. And the instructor said there's really no evidence to show that cannabis forms addiction in the same way as other substances. Well, we've had a lot more data since then that challenges that idea, that we actually do see cannabis dependence and ultimately tolerance forming pretty rapidly with THC. A part of this too is that THC products are in much higher doses than they used to be. So it's a pretty potent substance a lot of the times. And anytime someone quits a substance and reports withdrawal, that implies that there was dependence and tolerance happening. So we do see withdrawal symptoms with folks who quit using cannabis. They can be a lot more profound for folks who use more heavily. And sometimes, though, there can be a delay in the onset of those symptoms. Cannabis is what we call lipophilic. It means it really likes fatty tissue, so it can kind of hang out in the body for a while. It doesn't mean that those markers hanging out in the fatty tissue being there doesn't mean that that person is still high, is still intoxicated, but it means those markers are still present. It can kind of trick the brain into thinking, there's still cannabis in the system. So it can take sometimes over a month for someone who's used heavily and then stopped to start feeling those withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal with cannabis can start to look like sleep disruption. That's one of the biggest ones. They may have tremors. They may be anxious or irritable, angry. May go through bouts of depression. May struggle with concentration. Cravings, headaches. A lot of the stuff we see with withdrawals from a lot of other products. I do want to acknowledge there is some newer research the past couple of years tying the development of schizophrenia to cannabis use, and it's specifically around high dose cannabis use. This is research that's come from other parts of the world, a lot in the Netherlands, some in Canada, and other parts of Europe. And I do want to distinguish, there is a difference between chronic schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder and an acute bout of psychosis symptoms. This new research, though, is suggesting that increased bouts of acute psychosis from THC can increase the risk of developing a psychotic disorder. And it seems to accelerate symptoms for those who are already at risk for developing a psychotic disorder. So the risk factors this research found, like I mentioned, was higher doses of THC. This research defined high dose THC as anything with at least 10% THC. And I mentioned earlier that most products sold in Washington are well above that 10% threshold. In 2020, so older data now, but I think it's still pretty profound. 97% of all legally sold Washington cannabis flower, this isn't even concentrate, just flower, contained over 15% THC. So other risk factors are heavy use or frequent use, especially daily, and then starting use at a young age. And that reminder, human brains keep developing until about age 25. So that's important to keep in mind. I know we have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to just wrap this up now. So, is vaping safer than smoking? I get this question a lot, and it's a very tricky answer. There is an FDA-approved list of 34 vape products now. At least it was 34 when I last looked a couple months ago on this website. And then these are nicotine products, they're not cannabis products. Vaping may be safer than smoking, but it depends on what we're talking about exactly. It's worth noting completely switching from smoking to vaping is most likely less harmful than fully smoking or smoking and vaping, but emphasis on completely switching. There are generally fewer total carcinogens there, but a reminder that safer does not mean that it's fully safe. So some of the really common vape products, like those disposable ones I mentioned, those disposable salt-based flavored products, are not FDA approved, yet they're being sold anyway. There is still a big concern with ultrafine particles, regardless of the substance. And again, adolescents are more likely to vape than they are to smoke. So the presence of vaping products is pulling folks in, pulling kids in into this habit, into this potential addiction, who may not otherwise have ever used nicotine or cannabis as well. So just those are some things to keep in mind in the kind of nuanced discussion around which is more harmful, vaping or smoking. Okay, so 5 minutes left. I got to remind folks of the poison helpline, 800-222-1222. Whether you're seeing this now or watching the recording, please just punch that into your phone so you have it at the ready if you ever need it. For folks who are interested in another training on this kind of thing, I'm actually working with Stilly Valley Health Connections to host an additional one, all focused on cannabis. So we'll take a much deeper dive into cannabis on Friday, November 4th at 11 a.m. I'm not sure, Christina, if we have a link ready for that, but pay attention to the Stilly Valley Health Connections calendar. And if folks are interested in having me present a different training, lead a different training, whether that's on cannabis or vaping or opioids, how to administer naloxone, adolescent substance use, anything like that, reach out to me. Education with the Poison Center is always free. I'm happy to work with you and kind of put something together depending on what you're after. Big, big, big thank you all to bearing with me this last hour. This is my email address. I will put this in the chat box as well, but feel free to reach out with any questions on this training, any questions on the materials, as well as any questions about scheduling a future training. If you have a poison emergency, though, do not email me. Please call the poison helpline. All right, I can hang out for a few more minutes to address any questions that pop up. I haven't seen any so far, but do feel free to hit me with those if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to those of you who joined us live. I did just want to share before anyone hops off and while we're waiting for questions that there is a quick 6-question survey that will pop up on your screen as you're leaving. So if you have any suggestions for future classes or any ideas for future programming with the Poison Center, we'd love to hear them. And then I also wanted to let you know, as Alex mentioned, we have an upcoming class with the Poison Center, and that one is on cannabis trends and perspectives, doing a bit more of a deep dive than we did today. And so I will send out that information in a link with the recording later today. So you guys will all have that if you want to learn more or to register. But that is all I have for now, so I will pass it back to Alex, and if there's any questions, otherwise we can get wrapped up.
Okay, perfect. Definitely fill out that survey, folks. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, future folks who are watching this recording. And like we said, please hit us up with any questions as you have them.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much, and everyone have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again, Alex.
Thanks, Christina. Great to see you.
All
Take care,
right, bye,
everyone.
everyone.